triumph over adversity. But there are two problems with that. The first is that this often isn't true. So behind any successful disabled person in particular, there are nearly always carers, often big socioeconomic advantages. So for example, we quite rightly celebrate the scientific achievements of Stephen Hawking, but his story isn't a story of personal triumph. His story is a story of an absolutely huge team of people who, and indeed technology, who worked really hard to essentially allow him to at least partly ignore the fact that he was disabled and focus on his work. Ignoring that means that people can point at a successful disabled person and go, well, if they can do it, why can't you? And the answer is because we don't all have an equal amount of support. And then the second thing that is a problem with this personal triumph narrative is that by celebrating the hurdles being overcome, that stops us from getting angry at the fact that they exist in the first place. And again, you know, if they can do it, why can't you? Or like if, you know, if this small disabled child can triumph over adversity, then anyone can. It's not true. Not everyone can get over those hurdles, and saying that absolves us of doing the work of making sure that the hurdles don't exist in the first place. So obviously there are big structural things that we need to change, but where I'm coming at from today is just talking to you about my own personal experiences and things that I think we can do as individuals to help people like me stay in academia. And I do just want to say that this is entirely my own personal experience, and I'm not a scholar of disability, because there is a lot of research that that goes on that so that there are definitely people out there who have a better idea of how to make things work than I do, but this is just from my own personal perspective. So just to give you an idea of the kind of stuff that I need, so because I'm deaf, obviously I don't hear very well, so when I'm in a meeting or like an in-person situation, I have a piece of equipment that's called a radio aid that essentially amplifies the voice of the speaker, cuts out background noise, and makes it a lot easier to understand them. In Zoom calls and things like this, what I needed, interestingly enough, not any equipment for myself, but I need other people to have okay microphones and stuff, because what that does is it makes it easier for auto captioning to work, and it makes it easier for me to hear people. So there's some practical equipment that is useful for me. And then I also need things like someone to take notes for me or caption support to make sure that I don't miss anything. My research is, as we've established, hugely impractical for a deaf person, in that what I do is I record people making like sounds, and I then need someone to help me transcribe that. And do the kind of perceptual work for me. And then because of my various chronic illnesses, I have really variable energy levels, which means that I generally need to work shorter hours than other people. And I need the flexibility to, well, you know, back when we weren't all working from home, the flexibility to choose whether or not I work from home or go into work. And to be able to have some kind of control over my hours. So I'm going to give you a bit of a, this is going back quite far in time. This is going back to when I did my MSc. This is a story about a time when I didn't get the help I needed. The picture is not relevant here. I just thought that you might like to look at a cat while I talk. So in the UK, the government will fund the equipment and support that you need to access employment or education. either through disabled students allowance, which is for students, or access to work, which is for employees. And the process is a little bit convoluted because you as a disabled person have to apply for the disabled students allowance or the access to work. So there's a form that you have to fill in and you send it back to the government, and then they arrange an assessment and they give you a list of things that you need. But then that then also goes to your university, and your university is in charge of actually getting you the things on that list. So when I started my MSc, I contacted the University Disability Support Office as soon as I accepted my offer. I did all of the organisational bits that I was meant to do. I got my assessment, it got sent to them, but they didn't get in touch with me until after term had already started. And it took them something like 6 to 8 weeks to get me the equipment and the note-taking support I was meant to have. And this was absolutely catastrophic for me. So I need to emphasize that I'm at this point that I'm quite smart. You know, I was coming into that MSc having already been given a scholarship for it. But I just hopelessly fell behind. I couldn't follow the lectures because I didn't have the equipment that I needed. I didn't have the note-taking support I needed to catch up on it. And obviously I just started the course, so it wasn't like I already had friends that I could ask to borrow their notes and stuff, and I shouldn't have had to anyway. And I nearly quit entirely. Eventually, I managed to, like, thanks to my personal tutor, we managed to figure out that it would be manageable for me to do it part-time. But that was very nearly the end of my career in academia before it had even begun. Not because I wasn't capable, but because I wasn't supported. And so this is really what I want to say, is that it's not just, obviously we all know that it's not just about recruitment and getting people in, it's about making it possible for them to stay. And the failures that I've listed there are largely organisational. I do need to say that it wasn't just the university being incompetent, it was the university systematically underfunding the disability office, which at the time that I was there had 2 staff members for the whole of UCL, which is an enormous university. So it wasn't just people being incompetent, it was the university not directing funds where it was needed. So that's a big systematic problem, but there's a lot of things that, there are a lot of problems that disability causes me that can be ameliorated in some way by individuals. So the concept of the second shift is quite common in when we talk about women, particularly in academia, and people with caring responsibility. But it's also something that I think can be applied to people with disability. So one of the sort of, it's not really funny because it's true, jokes that I make is that the thing that is most disabling about being disabled isn't the actual disability, it's just all the admin. So like I said, with that, with that story that I just told, not only was I having to do the work of applying for access for disabled students allowance in the first place, I was also having to spend huge amounts of my time chasing up all of the people who were meant to provide me that support. With all of these things, so with access to work and disabled students allowance, you, the disabled person, have to apply for that support. Your employer can't do it for you. So that's a whole extra thing that you have to do when starting a new job or a new course of study that able-bodied people just don't have to do. And then there's also other benefits that you might need to apply for, such as personal independent payment, which basically just sucked up about a month of my life last year. So I have to, I've received some form of disability benefit since I was a child. But you have to, even though I'm going to be disabled for the rest of my life, I have to apply for it every 5 years or so. And it's a horrible process. It's basically several months of just dwelling on everything that's wrong with you. And the new iteration of it, personal independence payment, you now have to go and sit in a room face to face with someone whose job is to deny you the benefit and tell them all the things that are wrong with you, and they're not sympathetic about it. So that's both hugely time consuming and emotionally draining. And that's what I mean by it's an incredibly adversarial benefit system. I've claimed various government benefits. I don't think that I've done it a single time when there wasn't some kind of mess up by the council. Like they told me that I wasn't entitled to something that I was entitled to, or they made me jump through hoops that I shouldn't have to have jumped through. And again, it's just very exhausting and time consuming. And that's something that I'm doing on top of my full-time already, like job that I already do. And then they're kind of like small extra things like I always have to remember to take my radio aid places, and I always have to turn up early to in-person talks to make sure that the speaker has my radio microphone and to make sure that everything's working. And I just don't get the same amount of flexibility around my schedule that others do. So, for example, back in the days when we could all go to conferences, so for most people, when you go to a conference, you might plan out some things in advance, but you've still got quite a bit of flexibility on the day. So if you're all
sorry, Sophie, just a time notification to just
so if your colleagues are going somewhere, then you can just go with them. But I can't do that because I will have I'll have support scheduled in, and if I go somewhere else, then I won't have the captions that I need and that kind of thing. So very quickly, here's what you can do. So you need to ask the person about their needs and then make it your job to remember what you're told. Because it is really exhausting having to, so I'm always very open about the support that I need, but quite often people sort of listen and they nod and then it just kind of like goes in the mental trash heap, and I have to keep reminding them that they need to look at me so that I can lip read them, or that I can't work like late because of my energy needs and that kind of thing. So ask them about what they need and then make it your job to remember it. Especially if they come from abroad, they may not be keyed up on the UK benefit system. So at the least you should know that access to work exists and have some idea of how you apply for it, because occupational health will normally tell you to apply for access to work, but not really give you any guidance on how to navigate that. And then be prepared to advocate on their behalf and think about things for them. So one of the really lovely things that Camilla has done for this, for example, is to go and research different ways of captioning things and test them out beforehand, and like really put the work into figuring that out rather than relying on me to do it. Apologies for the cat butt. Similarly, some of the nicer things that people have done for me are to go and complain on my behalf when captioning isn't working, and things like that, because it just becomes really exhausting having to advocate for yourself all the time. And then the other thing that had really helped me is connecting to people who are like me. And if you know people who might be prepared to have a chat about their experiences, then do that. Put the person in touch with people who are like them. And my contact details on the first slide of this, like I'm very happy to be a person that you put people in touch with, or you get in touch with if you've got similar experiences. And then the very last slide is it's just a poem that I thought we might all enjoy. And it's from a book of poems about ships, but I really like it as a sort of metaphor for academia, a metaphor for being an underrepresented group in academia. And it's particularly the last verse, which is venture on, and if you suffer, swear that the next venturer shall have less to bear. Your way will be retrodden, make it fair. That's just, I work in the School of English, so I had to get a bit of literature in there somewhere. And that's it.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you. Yeah, maybe we'll do a Zoom clap, the worst of all. Thank you. So we have a couple minutes for questions. If anyone wants to type a question into the chat, then I'll read it out. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to ask this question from Ivan, Sophie. So Ivan asks, in my experience, the people most interested in rags to riches success stories tend to be very privileged themselves. Do you share this opinion? And if so, why?
So I think that a lot of people, so I sort of agree, but I also think that a lot of people who are invested in rag to riches things are people who think that they've gone through that same process. So there's quite a lot of people who are in a very comfortable position now, but might not have been as a child. And I think that basically it comes from two things. So first of all, you kind of want to believe in yourself as a success story, and then if you were born into privilege, then you kind of want to, I think it's all part of the same thing. Like if you're successful, you want to believe that it's because of something that you've done rather than because of the privileges that you've accumulated along the way. And I think it's, sometimes it's very tempting to view myself in that way. So it's like, well, I'm disabled, and like my mum and dad didn't have any money, and now I'm a quasi-successful academic. But actually, I think it's really important to kind of try and remind yourself about all the help that you've had along the way. I think that some people just aren't very self-reflective in that way.
Yeah, everyone likes to attribute things to themselves. Okay, wonderful. So I suppose let's stick with time, and I'm going to hand over chairing to Shivam.
Great. Hi, everyone. So our next speaker is Dr. Jo Begbie. Jo is a fellow and a tutor at Lady Margaret Hall at the University of Oxford, and she's the architect of the foundation year at Oxford University, which I think has gone on to inspire a similar program in Cambridge. So I think we're all excited to hear some of her insights into running this fascinating program. So I'll hand over to Jo now.
Okay, thanks, Shivam. Let me just get my talk up. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Okay, can you all see that okay?
Yeah, it looks fine to me.
So I guess a number of things. One, I just wanted to say thank you for that talk before, because it was really fascinating to listen to. So as Shivam said, I'm now running the foundation year at Lady Margaret Hall, and in fact it is going into Oxford University. So it will be Oxford University wide, and Cambridge are going to be launching something similar. But I just, I've got in my title slide here, where else in the pipeline do we need to fix the leaks? And in part, I feel, I kind of don't want to say I feel ashamed, but I guess I was a female scientist and I moved sideways into doing this. And so I feel a little bit like I have been a leak from the pipeline that I shouldn't have been. But in many ways, one of the things that I wanted to do then was actually look at everything about education and how we end up where we are, and think a bit about how to make this a fairer, I guess, you know, a bit of a fairer society, really, but thinking about, well, you know, why are there differences in who ends up in the academic jobs? And so I then, looking around for where else this has been looked at, I found that the Royal Society had looked at the UK scientific workforce as a whole back in 2014, looking at a lot of data sets that were out there and focusing in on gender, disability, ethnicity and socioeconomic background. I think because those are essentially the ones that are slightly easier for them to look historically at, because we might tick those boxes in job applications, etc. And I suppose the one that I want to focus on is around socioeconomic background. So, you know, Sophie mentioned that she had come from a background which actually you wouldn't normally see well represented in academia. So, you know, she's kind of done a bit of my talk for me in terms of that introduction of that being unusual. So, you know, essentially what the Royal Society showed was that really the chance of going into science and continuing in science was far less likely if you were from a lower socioeconomic group. So, you know, already you've got that disparity occurring. They were looking at data which was from back at, you know, you can see here on the slide from 1986. So
Jo, sorry, your slides are currently in
if I do that,
not in full screen right now. Sorry about that.
Thanks for shouting. So if you look, so now that's bigger and presumably you can see it. So if you look here, just that the data's from back in 1986 that they were looking at, but I don't think things have changed very much. And, you know, they point out that the lack of diversity represents a potential loss of talent. So this was something that I was interested in. And for me, I think a lot of this occurs at a school level. You know, we're kind of finding that different socioeconomic groups in terms of their achievement at school are going to be different. And so this is a paper that was looking specifically in science and how students got on in their GCSEs and A-level grades. I've put A-level grades up because I'm interested in the progression to university. And one of the things that talks about socioeconomic group is whether a student is eligible for free school meals or not. And you can see that if a student has free school meals, then they are not achieving the same level grades at A level as those who have, or, you know, there's a lower percentage of them achieving the kind of grades to go on to a top university. And so I think this is one of those things where I've had a lot of discussions around this, around Oxford University, and, you know, the idea that asking for the same grades means that that's fair. You know, if we ask everyone to get an A, then everyone's reaching the same level. But, you know, I think really we need to rethink fairness and think about, well, what is the input? And so, you know, if we're thinking about it being fair that everyone has to reach an A grade, then we're kind of looking at this equality, whereas actually maybe we need to be providing some support for people so that they can be having the same opportunities. So thinking about the opportunities that people have. So we started the LMH Foundation year back in 2016, and it was really looking at the underrepresentation of particular groups of students at Oxford. So, you know, that can come in all kinds of shapes and sizes of the people who are underrepresented. And we were, like I said, there was a course that's been running in Trinity College Dublin for, well, it had been running for nearly 20 years at the time, and they were showing that there was a very good progression from people from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds onto their foundation year, onto undergraduate, and then out at the other end. So we had a kind of a success story behind it. So we, you know, so why focus on socioeconomic group rather than any of the other characteristics that may be underrepresented? I mean, in part it's because there's an intersectionality there. And so if you think about socioeconomic group, then you may encapsulate some other characteristics as well. And so if we define our socioeconomic group by the occupation of parents and parental education as well, then you can see that normally in Oxford, everyone is from a very high level sort of professional managerial role and has a degree, whereas the UK population looks more like this. So we've kind of got a tipped scale already. So how can we change that scale? And for me, it was about then understanding that it's about this equality of access. So, you know, we're saying everyone has to get A stars and A's at GCSEs. And if you look at the percentage of students who achieve those A stars at GCSEs, then you can see that the percentage of disadvantaged state school students who achieve high level GCSEs is much lower. So already we're kind of filtering out those students if we're asking them to get the same grades. So that's why we designed our course for those academically able students who, you know, teachers would say that they had very high potential. We have a lot of work with schools, and we then want to provide a full year of teaching and personal support so that they can then reach that potential that we think that they should have, and then for them to progress on to the undergraduate degree. And as I say, we are now in year 5, which is slightly unbelievable. It feels like just the other day we started it. And that both Oxford and Cambridge, seeing what we've done, have decided to do it, which is really good. So just to, I mean, just because this is a story about people, rather than it just being all about numbers and everything, I wanted to, you know, these are the students who have so far been through our foundation year, and one of them asked not to be identified in photos, so I've had to, you'll see that someone is blanked out. But, you know, so they're a wonderful bunch of young people. So we basically, you know, the philosophy behind it is that remembering that these students have potential but have not necessarily achieved the school grades because of things in their background. We do subject-specific teaching to ensure that they've got, you know, that they feel secure in the knowledge behind the subject they want to go into, and so that they have that academic confidence. But we also do some sort of preparation for undergraduate studies, so study skills, writing skills, but also just working on personal confidence, etc., just to help them succeed. So the idea is that we want them to go on and thrive either at Oxford, or if they choose not to stay at Oxford, on another selective university. Okay, so essentially we have, oh no, not yet. So basically it's small numbers in each year, because this actually represents 10% of our first year intake into the college as a whole. We would have about 100 students. 10 students coming onto the foundation. It doesn't sound like big numbers, but it's making significant differences. And so far, the students are all remaining on course, which is fantastic. And, you know, that might sound like a small thing, but you know, often people from particular socioeconomic backgrounds will drop out for various reasons, whereas all of our students have remained on course during the foundation year, but then also during their undergraduate degrees. So they haven't all stayed at Oxford. Sometimes that's because they didn't quite reach the level that we hoped they would achieve, but in other cases actually it's where they've decided that after a year at Oxford they would prefer to go elsewhere. And for me that is also a sign that we have given them a lot of academic confidence, because they've looked at what we could offer them and decided that actually maybe what is on offer somewhere else is better. And we've just had 4 of our first lot of students graduate, so the other 3 are on what were 4-year programs, so they will graduate next year. And I suppose really just to highlight that they've graduated from their degrees with 2 1s, and one of them got a first, and that's even though some of them, I mean, this is an anathema for Oxford, some of them had B's and C's at A level coming in. And so the fact that they can now have left Oxford University with 2 1s and one of them a first, even with C's, has been, I guess, one of the reasons why people have decided that maybe this is something that they should follow up. And I guess I just also wanted to point out that, so we, when you look at the foundation year applicants, then obviously we're deliberately tipping it the other way. But, we are seeing applicants from a particular group. We've also seen an increase in those students across the college. So, not just on the foundation year, we're getting applicants from a different selection of students who are applying directly to the college, and an increase in care leaver and estranged students. And so I suppose really that's just that ripple effect. And that once you invite the students in, and also I would just echo what the first speaker said about actually listening to them and what they need and providing them with some of that support and other people like them to talk to, etc. So, all of those things, then other students follow, and it's made the college a much more diverse and lively and intellectually stimulating place. So in terms of, how many of these will stay in academia, how many of these students will stay in academia, that is another place where we might have to plug the pipeline, because financially carrying on to graduate studies is more tricky, but that's another conversation for another time. So I'm focusing very much on that bit of the pipeline, in terms of actually getting people with potential to highly selective universities where they can at least begin to build an academic career. And I think that is my last slide, so I would then take any questions. Let me just stop sharing as well.
Great, thank you, Jo. I mean, I think that was very inspiring personally, and I hope that other people in the audience were also inspired. If anyone has any questions, if you could just type them in the chat for me, I will read them out, or Jo can read them as well, whichever is easiest. Perhaps I'll start with something then. So you mentioned that the foundation year students tend to have quite a good kind of network with each other. How do they kind of integrate into the college and the university more widely?
So, yeah, I mean, that is a good question. They really, I mean, let's call them the direct entry students, because that's the easier way of thinking of it, are very welcome. I mean, so to be honest, as I said about it has made college an opener place. I think the students, the interaction between the students, they are essentially the same as undergraduates. They get treated the same as undergraduates. They live in amongst the undergraduates. So I think people don't really notice the difference, if that makes sense. So I think initially they did, because obviously it was a new thing. And so there was a little bit of that first time round. But then as we have had more people in the college, then yeah, they all integrate just fine.
Yeah, I can see a couple of questions that asked similar questions. How do you select students for the foundation year, and how do they select themselves when they're applying?
I mean, that's a very good question. So we have very strict eligibility criteria. So that's one of the ways in which we make sure that people would be from the correct background. I mean, again, remembering we're trying to think about people who have high potential. And so we look at, we get 2 teacher references. So we're thinking very much about, what the teachers say about them. They have to write an essay. So again, we can look and see what it is that they say about the subject, why they want to pursue that subject. So we're kind of getting an idea of their academic ability. We do interview them. So we will shortlist them and then interview them in a toned down form of an Oxford interview. So it will, because we're still interested in problem solving and interest in the subject, etc. And sometimes with these students, they might be lacking in confidence, but what's incredible is you then get them talking about their subject and suddenly they come alive, and you kind of have this great conversation with them about I don't know, something that they've been doing in biology where you think, wow, okay. So that I think that's, so I guess the other thing is we have a lot of interactions with organizations like the Social Mobility Foundation, who are interacting with these students in schools, so people from these particular backgrounds. I think the most important thing actually is interacting with the schools and changing the teachers' perceptions, so that the teachers encourage students to apply to Oxford. And I think it will be the same for Cambridge. In the end, you have a lot of, I don't want to call them gatekeeper teachers, but I'm going to call them gatekeeper teachers, who kind of say, oh, well, are you really sure? Are you really sure you want to go and do that? I mean, the other thing for science actually is that there's an element of, and I haven't worked out how to do this, but conversation with parents I think would be quite important, because people are not necessarily encouraged to do a science, they're encouraged to do medicine or, a vocational course. And, then for someone to say that they want to do psychology, for example, one of our students who is still on course doing psychology, I remember having conversations with her older brother, who essentially was the person who had been bringing her up, kind of arguing, well, why should she come and do it? He was saying, why should she come and do that? Surely she should go and do something else. And fortunately, she had the strength of character to say, I'm going to go and do this course, and I'm going to do it. But it's, again, it's those, there's a bigger sort of holistic picture that obviously it's beyond me to address, but if we can start getting those conversations out in the wider society, it's good.
There's a slightly more complicated question. If you started the foundation year again from scratch, what, if anything, would you change? Yeah,
well, that's a very interesting question, because essentially I am starting again from scratch by now taking on Foundation Oxford. So I have just been employed to do that one. And actually, a lot of the things we changed as we went along have been useful. And so to an extent, I've made those changes. Some of the things that I would have changed immediately, I have now changed as I've gone. So I suppose, if I could go back in a time machine, then I would have put in place more of what I've got now. So I think, to be honest, if I could do it all again, what I would want is a sort of a bigger cohort and a more pan-university way of doing things, so that it's not just, so although I say 10 is a large number for our college, it's not necessarily a large number for the university. And it does mean, because someone's asked in one of those questions, it does mean in some cases I've got one student doing physics, for example, which is, that one student can interact with the other one student who's doing maths, but they don't quite have that same kind of cohort feel. So it would be much nicer to be able to have more students doing physics, so that they can then interact and have conversations with each other in that way. So ideally, if I could go back and start again, I would do it pan-university, pan-subject from the outset. But a lot of the things that now going into Foundation Oxford I will push for are things like making sure they are a cohort, even if they're doing different subjects, making sure they have an identity so that they can feel like they're together.
Great. There's another question that said, do you or the staff on the foundation year work at all in supporting careers advice for A-level students that are considering further education, or for students that don't think that it's a pathway that's open for them?
So again, it's a really good question. I should point out that there's me and one other person working on this, and so there's not quite enough hours in the day, but that is key. And that comes back to what I was saying about lots of students wanting to do medicine. So definitely someone on our very first year who hasn't yet finished, because biochemistry is a longer course, was being pushed by her school for medicine. And I think because we didn't offer medicine on the foundation year, you know, she'd come to have a conversation with me about what else she could do. But actually, when you chatted to her, she didn't really want to do medicine. She was interested in the biological sciences and biomedical sciences and biochemistry. But no one had really had that conversation with her before, and no one had really explained what a biochemist was. And there I was an advantage because I was a biochemist. So I could say, well, actually, look, you know, there are things that you can do after biochemistry, and actually it's a fascinating subject to study. And she came to do biochemistry and has then thoroughly enjoyed it. And well, she hasn't told me that she's looked back and regretted it. But so that's, yeah, no, absolutely, conversations with schools and teachers, and to try and help that happen. I mean, one thing that I'm trying to do again with Foundation Oxford is to try and embed it slightly more in the Department of Education, so that I can interact with teachers, or, you know, trainee teachers, etc. So that again, we can be kind of saying, well, these are the kind of things we're looking for at the outset.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps last one before we go into a short break then. Edmund's just commented that Oxford colleges are notorious for setting high offers and being very strict about keeping them. Are there any tips that you have on convincing colleges to be less strict when it comes to very promising students from state schools?
I mean, again, a really good question. I mean, to an extent, that's what I am working on that. I mean, I suppose I've gone to the other extreme for now in terms of saying, all right, let's talk about the people who are kind of, I don't want to say they're much lower, because they're still not much lower. I mean, we're still asking them high grades to come onto the foundation year. But, you know, I'm saying that the thing that I don't want to do is bring some talented people in and then them struggle at Oxford, because it can be unpleasant. And I'm going to be very honest about that. Sorry, I probably shouldn't. But, you know, it can be such a fierce place. And so in a way, the foundation year is one of those, is meant to be saying, well, actually, let's give them some support so they can come and thrive. That's not to say that everyone needs that support, and there are going to be people from state schools who don't necessarily need that support. And I am working with, you know, now a bunch of academics who work on contextual offers, trying to think about, well, how can we determine whether someone's A is the same as someone else's A? And so whether we can actually have a more, well, just a kind of a more general countrywide way of saying, actually, this person's A level means this, because we can look at all of the things in their background and say, actually, for them to get a B is amazing. Work in progress. We'll try.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for answering all those questions, Jo.
Thank you for everyone asking them. It's great.
Yeah, thank you, Jo. So we'll reconvene at 12:10 to hear from the most dynamic duo that I know on spinning plates, combining caring roles and scientific careers. All right, see you all shortly.
Our next two speakers, who don't really need any introduction, so most of you will know them. So we've got Professor Laura van Harmelen, who is still very much a member of the Cambridge neuroscience community, but has recently been appointed Professor of Brain Safety and Resilience at Leiden University, and Professor Rogier Kievit, who until very recently was a programme leader at the CBU and is now a Professor of Developmental Neuroscience at the Dundas Institute. And they're going to be talking to us about spinning plates, combining caring roles and scientific careers. So over to you.
Great, thank you very much. So we're going to alternate slides, which will undoubtedly go seamlessly. So you have to bear with us, but I'm sure we'll get there in the end. Yeah, so we'll be talking a little bit about our experiences, NS2, of combining caring roles and a scientific career. And to give you a bit of an overview, we'll talk a bit about our backstory, both the linear and the less linear, less visible aspects of that. About some brief science and E&D background on combining careers with caring roles, at least in academia, and academia versus other careers, some pros and cons, and then finally advice on how not to take it. But first, Laura will tell us a little bit about our experiences. Oh yeah.
And feel free to interrupt as is depicted here. We're very happy to take any questions during the talk. So just start shouting or raise your hand or whatever. Why what is our story? I think that might be kind of give a nice background to what we're going to tell you next. So it started. So our plan. It started with both of us getting our PhDs in 2013 to 2014, roughly kind of the same period. We then went to Cambridge to do postdocs. We actually went there for a few months first, and that was going to be the last time that we ever went abroad, and we ended up staying in Cambridge, and we lived there for 8 years. We only returned this summer. So in 2014, I received a Rubicon Fellowship from the Dutch scientific kind of science organization, biggest funder in the UK, in the Netherlands. And Rogier got a Welcome Fellowship, so that's kind of the reason why we stayed in the first place. And then I became a fellow of Lewis Cavendish College in 2015, and Rogier at the same time became a program leader track at the CBU. And then after that, in 2016, I received a Royal Society Dorothy Hodgkin Fellowship, and Rogier became a fellow at FITS. So then we were really nicely integrated in Cambridge. And as Lorna just mentioned, we just took up new positions in the Netherlands. So we moved here only in August, and we both started in September, myself in Leiden in Education and Child Studies, and Rog in Nijmegen at the Donders. So this is kind of our academic career, but at the same time, we also had to spin a lot of plates because we also had a baby in 2012, Flinny. Who was actually supposed to be born in the UK, but he decided to come really, really early. So he ended up arriving in the week that we were supposed to move to the UK, and leaving us without a house with a baby in an incubator for 8 weeks. And we ended up having to live with friends and taking care of the baby. And only when he was out of hospital 2 months later could we move to the UK. So Rogier actually started this postdoc whilst being in the Netherlands with a baby in an incubator. Right, so then we both had to finish our PhDs still because we hadn't finished them yet. So that was interesting, trying to do some work whilst taking care of a young baby. You can see my tired face here. It's interesting. And then Flinny became really ill in almost a year later. He had to be hospitalized for roughly 24 times with an ambulance. So we had to go to hospital really, really often. And then after that, he stayed in hospital roughly once every maybe 2 weeks. So the next 1.5 years, basically we lived in Addenbrooke's and tried to do our work as best as we could whilst also having this baby in the hospital, which was interesting. And then in April 2015, Nova, our daughter, was born. And at the same time, Rogier only had 5 months left on his contract. So that was pretty interesting. And then we kind of applied for fellowships whilst having 2 children and trying to kind of combine working and children at the same time. So this and to highlight that it wasn't all just kind of very easy in terms of getting all the fellowships and the jobs that we get. We also wanted to kind of highlight the rejections or the kind of the other side, the negative side. So I applied for a postdoc at the CBU actually, and they rejected me. So that was my first real rejection. And then we both applied for all the Cambridge associateships at the colleges and received rejection from almost all of them. We applied for Henry Wellcome fellowships, for British Academy fellowships, and they rejected us. And we also had lots and lots and lots and lots of paper rejections, including these 2 glorious reviews. This paper might have been innovative a decade ago, or the claim is patently absurd. And also we applied, and this is mostly me, for lots and lots and lots of jobs, and were interviewed but didn't get the position. So this is kind of a lot of rejections, and let's say hurdles to overcome. Oh no, what happened? Okay, right.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about some E&D background and some science, and of course, in the interest of time, not too much. So there's some literature on career prospects with children, and it depends on, among other things, gender. So by among other things, I mean the various issues that have been raised before, including SES and disabilities. But one prominent factor, especially as related to having children, is gender. On average, there's a slight career boost for men in science for having children, and for academic women, on average, it does the opposite for a variety of reasons. Young fathers are slightly, or are more likely than young mothers to have tenure track positions after completing their PhDs, and women without children are less likely to become tenured than women with children, also known as the baby penalty. And I've definitely experienced the disparity in that any fathering kind of caring duties I undertake are applauded disproportionately, whereas Anna-Laura and many other women in science who I know do exactly the same thing, and that's basically baseline, and you have to go a long way to get the same degree of applause and cheering as men in science do, including the phrase, say, if I am babysitting the children rather than simply caring for my children. Recently, these disparities between men and women were amplified during the pandemic. The submission rate for the men, who were almost always the ones on Twitter saying, well, you know, Newton wrote his magnum opus during his lockdown, forgetting, some of the previous speakers highlighted, the caring roles that allow especially men to be especially productive during these periods. There's some more bad news for women, that on average, women have to sacrifice more and experience more stress and pressure from having children. So there's some challenges of a career in science with caring responsibility, and these are very subjective, but I think one big challenge is this job uncertainty combined with a kind of up or out career trajectory. So in science, you have to basically walk a kind of tightrope, and there's not much room for deviations or for breaks. And unfortunately, the most critical and most leaky career periods around the postdoc, assistant professorship, or lectureship coincide with the median time to try to have children. So they're both the times where children have the most impact, and also the time where many women, disproportionately many women, decide or are forced to drop out of a career in science. There's some challenges that a default academic career path can feel like the only good option, and it's not. And I think we should talk a bit more about other careers that are equally valuable as a career in science, and maybe also offer some benefits. The flip side of flexibility that I'll mention as a pro is that you also have trouble switching off, because, so I think the only way to maintain a career in science is to have and enforce some boundaries. And very pragmatically, in the early childcare years, money is a consideration. I think back of the envelope, it would have been impossible for either Anna-Laura or me to be a single parent in Cambridge paying £1,000 to the nursery every month. And now, having the background kind of support system of SES, so that was raised before, that can be the kind of time where you decide, I can't take up this postdoc, it's too risky, I don't have the financial resources to take this gamble or 2 or 3 years of a postdoc. Now, I think there are also pros of a career in science with care and responsibility. You have a lot of flexibility. Many of us can work almost anytime, anywhere. Of course, that is also a drawback, but it means we can more easily take time off, or to rearrange, or to catch up, and that simply is not possible in some other careers. As Anna-Laura mentioned, our son Flynn is quite severely disabled, and he requires a lot of extra appointments, and it's a unique career where we can basically take him in the afternoon to a bunch of doctor's appointments, then essentially have a break in the middle of the day, and then maybe catch up an hour or 2 in the evening, and still have the same number of hours and not necessarily lose productivity. For many of us, science is of intrinsic value or interest. We care really, or we're fascinated by it. For us, when Flynn was in the hospital for a long period of time, we kept working, and sometimes people said, well, how can you do that? So, well, that was in many ways kind of a lifeline. It felt like we still had control over something we cared about, that at least defined part of who we were and what we cared about. And I think that can be quite valuable, especially if things are challenging. A sense of perspective. Nova was born 2 weeks before my welcome interview, and I think that was quite helpful, paradoxically, because there really wasn't that much that 15 academics in black suits could do to scare me after we just spent time in the hospital and mother and daughter were both healthy. And depending on how much you value that, I think it's quite special that we have the opportunity to see the world and broaden our horizons in the period where you have young children who might be exposed to other cultures. And this is a pro and a con, is that as a parent, you have additional experience with what is known as time confetti, which is this pie chart you see here on the right. The more senior you become in science, the more your day starts to look like the bottom right pie chart, where you're split across 6-7 minute intervals, which is basically all that children will generally allow you. If they're quiet for anything more than 6 minutes, you should generally start to worry or call the police. Now, of course, these are only our experiences, but Anne-Laure did some nice Twitter polls where she asked other academics their experiences about the pros and cons of academia, whether or not it makes you more motivated. And there was some people stayed the same, some people made more motivated. And there is some benefit in that. So your work can become like a break from children. A lot of people mentioned more efficiency. I think that's something we've definitely experienced. If you know your day might end any time, then you'll make sure you get stuff done as soon as you possibly can. And that's experience where that quite a few people mentioned, especially if children are kind of past the first few months or maybe first year. You tend to focus on getting things done rather than how many hours you spend doing that. So the majority of parents responding, at least to this poll, said they became more efficient from having children. Happier, I think consensus is that it probably increases the variance more than it does the mean. So you have the higher highs and possibly lower lows, combination of how special it can be to have a parenting role, but also sleep, fatigue, stress, and all those things can make the lower lows a bit lower. And now finally, we'll tell you some advice that you should definitely ignore.
Yeah, so I think the best advice that I've ever gotten is to not take any advice. So please take this advice to heart. So as a young mum, and when I start to become a bit older in terms of my academic career, I've often had the question, when is the best time to have children? And this is something that people who are thinking about children have been thinking about for quite a while before they actually pose the question. But I want to say that this is actually the wrong question, because it assumes that there is a never and an always. There is a good time and a bad time, which is kind of not the case. But it also assumes that you can have children when you want them, and that I want to highlight that is not the case. So it kind of and because it ignores the many hidden challenges that are involved in trying for children if you want them, including miscarriages. And lots of people I know, including myself, have had miscarriages, and we don't really speak about them. So people assume that they don't happen. There's also not being able to have children and having to go through IVF treatments and having to bear the kind of hormonal difficulties and stress that accompanies that. And then finally, there's also this idea of needing to want to have children, and not everyone should have children, and people should definitely not feel that they should have children because of social pressures. So I wanted to kind of highlight this before I start into the, well, what is helpful and what is good in terms of balancing career and children. So in my opinion, and this is NS1, what helps? Well, definitely it helps to see people be successful whilst having children, and so role models. So personally for me, I worked with, so my PhD supervisor is a female professor, and she had 2 small children when I started my PhD. I had some other supervisors and mentors who have children who really became an example for me and really helped me, especially when I had my first miscarriage, and made me feel normal, that is something that everyone, well, some people might experience and deal with, and then you can still have a normal academic career and you can still be successful. The other thing that helps is good parental leave, especially shared parental leave, which I know had been kind of introduced in the UK from April 5th, 2015. So if you were due on April 5th, 2015, you could share your parental leave. And I know this exact date because my due date was April 4th, 2015. So I tried to get them to kind of fake my due date, but they they didn't want to help me with that. So Roger and I weren't able to share parental leave because of that, and ended up Nova being born on April Fool's Day on the 1st, so we weren't eligible at all. But this is really important aspect because of childcare and child leave, it's still perceived to be a liability when you hire women, especially when they get to their 30s and older, for positions, because of this idea of, ooh, they might have children and then they might take parental leave. And by sharing parental leave, we're kind of reducing that liability that is on the shoulders of women at the moment. Well, next to that, you need to have flexible workplaces. I can't remember the amount of times that I brought Flinny and Nova to work at Douglas House during meetings. I was working with Professor Ian Goodyear, and he would hold Nova or Flinny and he would kind of bounce them whilst we were having our group meeting. So, and that really enabled me to continue working, to be involved, to do stuff. So normalizing people having to bring children to work. I remember Roger had an E&D meeting where, I can't remember why, but he had to bring Flinny. So Flinny was just sitting there happily in his maxi cozy during the meeting, and no one said anything. Everyone was just like, okay with that. And such work environments are really helpful. In addition to that, keeping meetings to core hours and not scheduling them at 6 when we have to pick up children and stuff is really important. So a supportive work environment is key. And I've already mentioned, Roger has already mentioned help with childcare. So in addition to kind of my opinion, I also asked the Academic Mamas Facebook group what they said. And so this is 10,000 academic mamas. And the most important thing, the most important aspect was indeed a supportive partner and awesome daycare. So really you can't have a academic career and parenting if you're not feeling supported. It really makes such a big difference. So the final slides, the best advice that I've ever been given when I started my postdoc was actually from a lady called Radhika Nagpal. She's a professor in computer science at Harvard, and she wrote an awesome blog. It's called The Awesomest 7-Year Postdoc, or How I Stopped Learning How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Tenure Track Faculty Life. And I highly recommend this blog, and I'll briefly highlight the kind of her key advice. She decided that she was not going to take any more advice. She created a feel-good email folder. I do that too. So whenever someone sends me something nice, I put that in my feel-good email folder. And when I feel low or when I have a stupid rejection, I go through my folder, and it really helps. The other aspect that she suggested, and this I want to highlight because it really is key, she decided that she was going to work no more than 50 hours and in fixed days. And Roger and I tried to adhere to this as well. So we have a rule that we don't work in the weekends, and we really try to stick to that. So only in the case of kind of grand deadlines or major things will we work in the weekends. And the other advice that she gave is that she tried to be the best whole person she can be. So when you want to be a top academic and but also have children, and you aim to be the best mum or the best dad and the best academic, you're going to necessarily fail at both. So if you then, instead of that, try to aim for the best whole person, so the best parent and academic, that is a much more sustainable goal to strive for. So thank you very much for listening to us and to our kind of NS2 story. We're very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was really, really interesting, inspiring. Questions in the chat? We have one. So Edwin, so somebody has said, on shared parental leave, while great in theory, in practice can be financially inviable for the higher salaried partner to actually take it. So yeah, any tips on, yeah.
I mean, I agree. But even bigger problem than that, I think in Norway, it wasn't necessarily a financial burden, or at least not a great one. And there it took, or in Sweden, I think it took quite a while for the cultural norms to change for the fathers to actually take it. So they had to change the rules so that if you did not share it, then you would basically get less overall before the men would actually start taking it. And that's very much on the men, but it's also on the work culture that normalizes these things so that the men don't get an additional career penalty that taking care of your children implies you don't care about your job. So I think those norms need to change, and they need to change fast. Of course, yeah, the financial component is definitely a thing that goes through all of these. So if you're from a more fortunate middle class background, then you can take a gamble, even if you're not fully supported or don't receive necessarily additional money. Careers in academia are often whether or not you feel like you can take a shot, or at least for a few years.
Yeah.
Lorna, should I read these out?
Yeah, so somebody said that they didn't understand why having children was a career boost for men.
It's a good question. It's a bit of a mystery. I think there is some cultural analysis that suggests that that's basically the model for men in careers, regardless, to be the head of the household. Is really kind of terribly old-fashioned perspectives. So maybe fitting in better with that mold of being a successful scientist might help. The other thing I did notice before is that as a man, if you undertake normal 50-50 parental duties, you get cultural bonus points for doing so. I mean, I took every Wednesday off with Nova when she was a baby, wandering around Cambridge with her strapped to my stomach. And I'm quite sure quite a lot of the looks at me were basically saying, oh, the mother must have passed away or something like that. Like how on earth could this father be walking all by himself unsupervised? Yeah, so, but I don't have a good answer to that, but I think it's to do with the cultural expectations. Okay,
Camilla, do we have time for one quick last question? So just thinking about, have you experienced any differences between the UK and the Netherlands now that you've gone back?
There's one big difference. I mean, we both worked at really supportive environments in the UK. So, but despite that, the academic dads that we saw did not take a day off during the week to do childcare. Whereas in the Netherlands, that is almost the norm. So in the Netherlands, people, if they have children, they work 4 days a week. So the mum does 4 days, the dad does 4 days, and the child goes to nursery 3 days a week. And that's because it's super expensive to pay for childcare. So it's kind of by necessity that people do this, but it's so normalized here that it was really weird for us in the beginning in the UK to not have that. And to then, so what we did is we decided then, okay, then we're gonna both work full time. So we did 5 days of childcare. And
it's a bit surprising because I think institutionally the UK, at least in our brief experience, actually has a few things more than the Netherlands. My parental leave for Flynn was 3 whole days, unadjusted for prematurity. So basically when he was -8 weeks old, I was supposed to go back to work. Now, I work in science, so I could decide not to, and I was fully supported in doing that. But if I'd worked in a factory, I might have lost my job. Yeah. And I think the UK, in terms of Athena Swan, which is imperfect, but it does a very good job in many ways. I think actually the UK is ahead of the Netherlands, despite stereotypes of taking things seriously at the institutional level. But I think the Netherlands has more of an ingrained cultural norm of dads taking at least 1 day a week off. Yeah. So I think these things are not kind of a single dimension in which countries vary. And I think the best is a combination of the better policies of each country.
Yeah. Okay. Should we wrap up for interest of time? I think you're going to be around later for the discussion. So any other questions that the people have, I think you can ask later. So thank you, everyone, and handing over, is it Giugiu now?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to our previous speakers. It was amazing to hear from you. Our next speaker is Dr. Alfredo Carpineti, who is an astrophysicist, and he's also the founder and chair of Pride in STEM. He's a science writer, science communicator, and an activist. And today he will talk with us about what's like being LGBTQ+ in STEM. And I'm so excited to have him here with us. Thank you so much, Alfredo, and we're excited to hear from you. Over to you.
Thank you, Giugiu. Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, I've not had the chance to catch up more than the previous talk. That was absolutely fascinating. So I might be repeating some stuff that has been mentioned already, but in general, I will be discussing, now let me share the screen, what is like, you should be able to see the screen now. What it's like being LGBTQ+ in STEM in 2020. I've thrown in a little bit of what we could expect from the pandemic on our community and in general in STEM, but also some more upsetting things that have happened. And without further ado, is this working? Okay, who am I? I'm Alfredo. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the chair and founder of Pride in STEM, as Giugiu mentioned. Astrophysicist, science communicator, and journalist. But most importantly, I am a raging homosexual. And that's going to be clear because I'm going to be ranting a lot. So people of a sensitive disposition, be warned, because I might swear. I'm Italian, so English swear words really don't have any social stigma, so come out. So if you have really not been paying attention, I've been giving talk like this for a while now, and I've decided to do a little COVID edition, so adding a little bit more this year. So first of all, something that I get constantly is that science is not political. Science shouldn't be political, but it's not true. While some science happens in a physical vacuum, I'm a physicist after all, no science happens in a historical one. Science is and has always been political. You cannot find a piece of science from the ancient history to modern day that is not been influenced by its historical and social surroundings. So when people tell you science is not political, bend your head and just go, So why it is important that we discuss how science is political is because there is in our society a lot of hate and a lot of discrimination. And if we are pretending that science is apolitical, so not political, we are ignoring this hate. And this hate slows down the progress of institution, discourage individuals from becoming role models and actually counteracting that hate. Hate obviously is there to maintain the status quo, to keep those who have power in power. And hate at a personal level distracts us from our work because we constantly have to worry about what other people think about us and if our work is going to be treated fairly. And in particular, what I hear a lot when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community in STEM is that we're bringing identity politics into science, which is surprising because to me, science has always been identity politics. The fact that it was cis, straight, white men mostly, that's an identity. And the fact that we have so many examples, like probably the greatest mathematical mind of the last 300 years, Emmy Noether, she created the equation that underpins all of modern physics. And yet she was not allowed to teach under her own name. And she had to leave Germany because she was Jewish. So you cannot tell me that identity politics is something that is happening now. It's always happened. So diversity in science, this is in the UK and is from two surveys, one from 2014, so data from 2013, from the Royal Society, which had, the data from the Royal Society is very much quite blocky, at least in their presentation. There is obviously a big gender disparity, but there's no mention of people that are not identifying as either men or women. Black and ethnic minorities, there is no breakdown into which ethnic minority, and the disability, sorry, now I can't remember if between that and that or the other one. I think on the disability there is a little bit more breaking down of these identities. The Institute of Physics, what does a physicist look like, had a lot more of individual breakdown. I open up just the one about LGBTQ plus community. But something that was interesting was that they also interviewed groups of students that were planning to get into physics. And the 16 to 19 brackets in 2015, it was a lot more diverse, which really gives me hope that that diversity is now in physics. But I would love that if the Institute of Physics goes back and ask and check to see if the diversity has been kept or not, and trying to understand exactly where this leaky pipeline is. From the this Institute of Physics one, there is a surprising thing that 16.5% of people don't identify as heterosexual, which is a lot. I am quite surprised that it's so high, but even there is a mysterious 4.5 that is unknown. But even if it's just this about 10%, it's a great number. It tells us that there is a lot, our community, LGBTQ plus community in at least physics, it's quite significant. So why are we raging? We are raging because there are institutional and societal barriers that make its way into science and stop scientists, technicians, engineering, and mathematicians to come out. This is from Yoder Mattis from the journal Homosexuality. Should be 2014. 2013 is when they did the survey, and it shows how out people are to colleagues, to friends and families. And you can see that to colleagues and students, there is this sort of bimodal distribution that they're really out or really not out, which tells you that there are issues in academia that are stopping themselves. In 2016, the American Physics Society ran this LGBT climate and physics report, and it showed the level of harassment in the universities. And this is key. It's not just about people not feeling comfortable for just society reasons. There is actual active harassment in our institution that are stopping people to be themselves. And you can see from the statistic, it's obvious that there are intersectional issues. You can see that LGBT men are on average less likely to receive harassment compared to women, but we can see the gender conforming and trans people receive most of the harassment of our community. But unfortunately, more on that later. Some general points. There is a lack of education. There is this large fraction of people that have no awareness of LGBT issues. This one is, in my head, this is my favorite absurd things in this report. Employees are expected to not act too gay. So we're thinking about physicists. And I always think, like, if you have something that is acting too gay, you must have a scale of your gayness. I don't know, 0 on one hand, Elton John on the other. Where does a physicist lie? What fraction of an Elton John can a physicist be? Obviously, it's absurd. And the fact that there is 58%, sorry, expecting not to talk to guys, 42% of physics LGBTQ people feel that they need to tone themselves down. It's just absolutely, just makes you angry. So, and then there is a pressure for LGBT employees to stay closeted. 1 in 3 have been told by senior staff that if they win in physics, they need to stay in the closet. And again, 2016, even if we assume that the data was collected in 2015, it's not 50 years ago. Once again, trans and gender non-conforming people take the brunt of the harassment. So about 22%, they don't have a bathroom that they feel comfortable using, which, I don't know, like, I used to spend a lot of time in uni when I was an active researcher, and it doesn't feel nice that staying there 10 hours and not being able to pop to the toilet. Coworkers use my preferred pronouns, and this is not the case for over 40% of people. And it's like, it's not that difficult. Like, if you can remember some, like, the Maxwell equation of electromagnetism, learning they, them is not difficult. This is the last point is mostly US specific, because it's about health benefits related insurance that doesn't cover trans related needs. But also in the UK, the health system for trans and non-binary people, it's so flawed and there are so many hurdles. So if the institution can help, they should. This is not just bad for the people that are currently in academia, but it's also bad for the next generation. This is for LGB, so just sexual minority students, came out in 2018, and it's about the people that starts a degree in STEM subject, deciding if they're going to continue in STEM or not. And the sexual minority students doing more in terms of undergraduate research and interests, by the time they finish their 4-year degrees, there is about 9% less likely to continue in their career. And mostly is because they feel they don't belong and they don't have people like them in that field. Bringing it back closer to home, this was done in 2019 by the Royal Society of Chemistry, Institute of Physics and Royal Astronomical Society, and it's exploring the workplace of LGBT plus physical scientists and their experience. And we see that a good fraction of LGBT respondents consider leaving the workplace. And also, it's a good fraction on non-LGBT here, something profoundly rotten in the foundation. Again, as we've seen before, the trans replies are much worse, with trans people saying they consider leaving the workplace often. Again, we see that there are definitely some intersectional issues. I wish they've done more in intersectionality beyond mixing gender and sexuality. Would have been a lot more interesting. We can see that women experience more harassment, non-binary people experience even more. Again, trans people experience more harassment than cis people, and sexual minorities, they are not the one that are most known, like gay or lesbian or bi, experience a lot more harassment, and it's basic ignorance. So that's what it is. And again, we can see that there is 10% of heterosexual people that experience harassment, because there are intersectional issues that we are unfortunately still not seeing. And this is about how people feel in their work place, and they're like, look how many people feel very uncomfortable. This is absolutely absurd that we are in 2020 and there's people that are feeling that cannot be happy themselves, or at least like all right in their workplace. Okay, this is a quick summary, but I think I am running out of time, so I'll skip ahead very quickly. So the STEM world in a pandemic, I think this has been mentioned already about how women are publishing less during the pandemic, as it's been mentioned, for having more parental duties. There's also and it's not just STEM specific. There've been also studies in economy saying that women are taking less projects and being lead authors on less papers. And there's also these, again, many issues when it comes, for example, to Black researchers in the UK. One very that many people talked about was this, that despite there was several grants awarded to study the what the effect of COVID-19 was on Black, Asian and other ethnic minorities in the UK, there were no Black PIs selected despite Black PIs having proposed projects. In the specific for the LGBT community, what I would say, there's been a relentless attack on our community, which had not been stopped by the pandemic. Actually, having the world moving online has exacerbated some of these issues. I'm going to mention just a few, but if you want, I have a very, very, very long list, unfortunately. The Royal Astronomical Society was a victim of verbal abuse in person with terrible misogynistic and transphobic terms during a woman lunch in July 2019 at the National Astronomical Meeting, in which a man walked in and complained that the Royal Astronomical Society was accepting all women, and I started attacking trans and cis women at that lunch. In March, so you would remember that in March there was like this thing called the pandemic that started in lockdown, etc. And yes, there was an organized smear campaign that required a lot of work, as the world pretty much was on fire, to try and destroy the Royal Institution and Dr. Seuss Kundu, who just posted a simple tweet asking women to reply to a survey so that the Royal Institution could work better in creating women-led projects. So the campaign went from just complaining that trans women were allowed to participate in this survey to Sue's. She's Indian, so quickly moved to racism, to misogyny, to questioning why she would be a feminist that support trans women, and then move in a matter of hours on threads and on forums online. Emails to her work, her bosses were shared with the attempt to destroy her career and get her fired. Same happened to Dr. Puli Devi Sekera. She's the founder of Real Scientists. If you're on Twitter, you might have seen either her or Real Scientists. Again, another organized mirror campaign with transphobia, misogyny, racism, and doxing. And this was in September. The Royal Society of Biology just last month, actually it's ongoing, so just a few weeks ago, just posted I am a biologist hashtag, and they wanted just to have something live. It was quickly taken over by transphobic people trying to assault some trans biologists, etc. And when the Royal Society of Biology put out a tweet just asking for them to keep their transphobia out of their hashtag, another organized mirror campaign started. Again, more transphobia, misogyny, homophobia, and doxing. There's been so many emails to the Royal Society of Biology just asking for so many people in the society to be fired because they stood up for good science. And if you're just like, oh, that sounds bad, but what are these transphobic people saying? Well, we have here Janice Turner that has recently in the Times equate gay men to pedophiles for supporting trans people, denouncing the gender ideology. Where did she took that word, I guess? So if you don't know about gender theory, it's gender theory as a quotation mark. That is a discussion that started in Poland, extreme Catholic circuit. It moved to Italy in about 2014, where the theoria gender became a quick word against actual same-sex marriage, although nothing to do with what we intend as gender theory in the Anglophone world. And as you can see, as in Poland now that they're trying to ban abortion, women's rights, and LGBTQ plus rights, homosexual relation with gender ideology is what is being used to curb the rights of everyone apart from cis, straight, white men. But let's keep going. In the last week, this group called Transgender Agenda, this DVD called the Transgender Agenda has been sent to, I think, a few hundred schools in the UK and has been shared by famous UK scientists and science communicators. And they're organized by a group called Truth in Science. And as the word truth and science in it, you must be thinking they must be onto something. Well, yes, it's a United Kingdom-based creationist group that in 2006 tried to get the theory of evolution banned from UK schools, and now they are targeting our community. And there are UK scientists who are sharing this, and they should be just take a minute and thinking why they are in a cult. Because it is a cult. All right, so how do we stop the leaky pipeline of diverse neuroscientists?
Yeah, we should really start wrapping this up.
Also, I have 2 more slides.
Thanks a lot, absolutely.
You need to proactively stand by them and against discrimination. That's what you need to do. And how what kind of specific challenge we have? Discrimination from peers, senior people, lack of protection, lack of resources, lack of role models. You need to create a that is inclusive and intersectional, and it's not just you need to make people feel that they belong. So what do we need to do is challenge our own biases, understanding our privilege. We want revolution, but we struggle to achieve incremental positive changes. So we need to do a lot more. And this is something that we can do at an individual level. Pronouns everywhere, email signature, badges. If there is your name, there you can put your pronouns. Be an ally proactively. Learn about the issues. Learn about what are the dog whistle of our community, and make sure that you can step in. If you're seniors, share statement of support and participate in mentorship and awareness training. If you run an organization, here is the list. Gender neutral toilets, mark important days and months, make sure there are good policies at work, and safeguard LGBTQ people that work in your organization, especially if they need to travel abroad. The last thing is on November 18th, we celebrate LGBTQ plus STEM Day, the International Day of LGBTQ people in science, technology, engineering, and maths. It's going to be, well, online mostly. And with that, this is the supporter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alfredo. Thank you. Thanks a lot. We have time just for a very, very quick question. We're running a little bit out of time, but it was awesome, Alfredo. Thank you so much. Anyone, with a quick question for Alfredo before we go to have some lunch? You can type that in the chat. If there are no burning questions, I guess we can go. Okay, fab. We have one. So in your experience, does discrimination happen at the peer or the senior level? Great question.
Thank you very much for the question. In my personal experience, I have encountered only minimal, at least overt discrimination, and it was always been from peer level, and never had any issue with supervisors when it comes to my sexuality. But I have friends and colleagues that have very, very different experience. And this is why I think it's important to have data and surveys, because we are not seeing patterns. Even like, for example, even what we've seen on how women are publishing less during the pandemic because of caring responsibility, but we are focusing on just one aspect. There is so much more that we're not considering. How has the pandemic affected people that have disability? How is affecting people that have different needs that maybe the university were supplying for those needs, or they were not, and suddenly the pandemic maybe is not having to go into work is helping them. So we need surveys, but we need surveys that touch so much more than what we've been used so far. Oh, sorry about that.
Great. Let's break for lunch now, but actually I think Kevin's asked a really important question, so we'll come back to it in the discussion session, if you don't mind, Alfredo. Okay, so we've gone 5 minutes into lunch. Let's come back 5 minutes late. So I'll see you at half past, so 13:35. And then we will hear from Lorna plugging the leaky pipeline of women in science. Okay, see you all then.
But probably a lot of you are very familiar with it and possibly feel it yourself. It can manifest itself in many different ways. And I'll talk from my personal experience of imposter syndrome, and that's very much related to my race as well. And then some tips that I found very useful to overcome it. I struggled with it for a long time, and it's only recently that I've been able to kind of get to grips with it. So hopefully those tips can help you if you feel in a similar position. So what is it? Well, it's these sorts of feelings of inadequacy, self-doubt, intellectual fraudulence, and it's really, really persistent in the face of all other evidence to suggest that you're competent and intelligent and that you deserve your successes. You have this persistent feeling that you're a fraud, that you're an imposter, you don't belong, that everybody's much more intelligent and much more competent than you. Typically it manifests itself in this way of, I'm fooling others, I'm a fraud, I only appear competent, but everything that I've achieved has been luck or mistake. And so, you know, when there is success, it's attributed to something externally, like I was just really lucky or slipped through the net. And then there's also this feeling of not wanting to get found out. And paradoxically, either failure or success can feed this feeling, because if you're successful, then there's even more of a chance you'll get found out. You know, how do I keep getting all of these accolades and things? People are going to find out that I don't deserve any of this. Whereas if you fail or you get a rejection, then you just attribute that to, oh, well, you know, I'm not good enough, I'm not competent, so I deserve that failure. But it does have many, many faces, and quite often we talk about this, the kind of more traditional, I'm not good enough, I'm a fraud, that side of things. But there's also the more insidious type, which is that nobody looks like me at senior levels and I just don't belong. And that's often a feeling that comes along with being a minority, whether it's race or any other. So I want to talk a little bit about how it's manifested for me, my experience of it. And just to give you some context of my background, although it's not really that important, I did an undergraduate at the University of Bristol in experimental psychology. And then I did a research assistant job in Singapore at Duke NUS, where I learned about fMRI. And then I went on to do an internship, a research assistant position, and a PhD at the CBU. And then I went for my first postdoc to the Florey Institute in Melbourne, followed by 2 postdocs here in Oxford. So I'm on my 3rd postdoc here in Oxford in the lab of Masood Hussain. And the sort of first face of my imposter syndrome is really the academic variety. Oh, we might have someone joining us soon. So that is, we know that imposter syndrome is more common in academics. My version was very, very extreme. I would go to meetings, and if it went okay, I'd come out thinking, I can't believe I got away with that. I almost sounded like I knew what I was talking about. If I said anything that I thought was wrong, or I couldn't answer a question, you know, it would really feed into this, oh, everybody knows I'm an imposter now. And in fact, I had it so badly that I would think, I don't want to tell other people about it, because I thought they would think, well, actually, you are an imposter, so you should feel like that. So I just sort of held all of this in alongside some anxiety and depression that I had through my academic career. And the combination of this was just really exhausting to, you know, do on top of how demanding academia is. And then as a woman, we just heard from Lorna, there's, you know, ways that this plays into imposter syndrome as well. I'd internalized a lot of stereotypes, sexist stereotypes about myself. For a long time, I thought I was very bad at maths. I always had this like, oh, I'm terrible at maths. And I felt like I wasn't really naturally gifted in any kind of way. Yeah. And in fact, if I look at the evidence, you know, at school, I was always top set for everything. And I was in advanced groups, and I was, you know, particularly good at maths and science, but somehow I had got this stereotype in my head that I was terrible at maths. And I think that's probably because I'm a woman. And then within academia, the instances that fed into this, like, for example, I remember a colleague of mine, when I was new into my first postdoc, seeing some code and saying, oh, your code's, you know, quite complex. Did you write it yourself, or like, who helped you with it? And like that sort of thing just really feeds at what already I had this sort of hang up about coding. And so all of these sort of remarks kind of feed into this imposter syndrome that's going on in my head. Oh, why is this not moving now? Yeah, and then really most relevant today, I guess, is the imposter syndrome around my race, and the fact that we have institutionalized racism through academia really adds this other dimension. Oh, hello. We have somebody joining us. Sophie remains quiet. So I struggled a lot with my race and identity because I'm mixed race, and I know that my ethnicity and my race is quite ambiguous, and throughout my life people have always asked me, you know, where I come from and what specific mix my parents are, because it's very unsatisfying for people if I don't, you know, tell them exactly what race my parents are, how mixed I am or whatever. And I also had a lot of guilt over the fact that I don't think I experienced the overt racism perhaps my Black colleagues have, but then I also struggle to gauge the kind of privilege that I experienced by having slightly lighter skin. So this has really been difficult in terms of imposter syndrome from that sense. And as with many minorities, it's also fed by this lack of representation of people who look like me. So, you know, there's 21,000 professors in the UK, 18,000 of those are white. There's 140 Black professors, which seems so crazy, and only 25 of those are Black female professors. So really this lack of representation is just makes you think, well, maybe I don't belong here, maybe I won't make it through that academic career path. And I spent a really long time, partly when I was doing cognitive behavioral therapy, for trying to get a sense of why I had this very strong imposter syndrome. And like many people with these kind of complex backgrounds and histories related to their race, much of it was picked up from my parents. Oh, okay, so I'm going to stand and wiggle a bit. And worst case, you might lose my video feed. My parents grew up in apartheid in South Africa. This is them in the 70s. So they lived through segregation of their education, and they had very limited options available to them. They're educated separately, and, you know, very poor resources towards their education. And this sort of lifetime of state-sanctioned white supremacy obviously has a really profound effect on the identity and self-esteem. They just spent years feeling as if they were inferior, they were treated as inferior, and they had very little opportunities. Also, their parents were given, their parents, you know, didn't encourage them as much because they knew that, you know, there's no opportunities for you. So I'm not going to get you to dream of going to this big university because it's just not going to happen for you. But my parents knew that education was the way out of this. But of course, they're constantly rejected from universities and from trying to pursue education based on their non-white skin. But here, I just wanted to show you, so we talk a lot about rejection in academia. This is a rejection letter that my dad got. He actually has a whole thick book full of rejection letters that from when he was applying to different educational courses in South Africa. Here saying, as the college is a college for white students, the state has laid down the applications for non-white students must be referred to both the Peninsula College for Advanced Technical Education and the Department of Coloured Affairs for consideration, right? So I suspect there's not many of us who've had a rejection letter quite like that, but my dad has a whole folder full of these things. He wanted to go to this technical college to get an engineering degree, but as it was a white college, he wasn't allowed to go there. He had to go to the coloured college, of course, very poor resources, very substandard education, because the basis of white supremacy is to not allow non-whites to, you know, to educate themselves to get ahead. So in the end, he ended up doing an apprenticeship, which he had to choose on the basis of just that he would be allowed to do on the basis of his race. And then he came to the UK where he got a master's degree in engineering. But when he went back to South Africa, despite having these qualifications, he still was not allowed to work. He actually had a phone interview and was offered a job in a major company. But when he turned up there, they saw he wasn't white and said, sorry, you can't work here. So all of this, you can imagine, leaves a sense of inferiority and imposter syndrome. And he always felt as if he had to work twice as hard to get half as far. And I really think I inherited that, and which in one way is very good because I got his work ethic, and it's an amazing work ethic. He works very, very hard. But I also internalized this idea that I have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And when we look at the stats of representation in academia, it's really hard to, you know, deny that. So I think when we think about diversity and inclusivity, we really need to think about these different facets of it, some of which we can address personally, and I'll give some sort of tips on that, but others are really created by the environment, and those are when people don't feel welcome or they don't feel represented. So some tips on how to overcome it, though, I found really useful. One of the main ones is that just because you believe something doesn't make it true. So I had to show this, you know, Trump, this could be any of his tweets. But we have these core beliefs, and by virtue of how long we've had them, we seek evidence to confirm them, and they become really persistent and persuasive. Okay, this one wants to come out. But just because you believe something doesn't make it true, even if you really, really believe it, which I did. And I think phobias are quite a good example of this, because, you know, if you have a fear of flying, for example, you might go on a plane, experience turbulence, and you think, this is it, the plane's going to crash, this turbulence tells me it's going to crash. And that's all you can think, and you believe this to be true. But of course, you've interpreted the situation completely incorrectly in line with your beliefs. And so it's really important to keep reminding yourself of that. I've also found it really, really useful to question the kind of faulty logic that is behind imposter syndrome. So this is the kind of more traditional imposter syndrome that you know, you're not good enough, you're not, you don't belong. Not that you don't, you know what I mean, the kind of less related to race and minority status. But if you are an imposter and everyone else is so smart, then how are you fooling them, right? They can't be that smart if you've spent this whole time fooling them, even though you don't know what you're doing. And then we think a lot about confirmation bias in terms of our research, but, you know, we're really highly susceptible to it in real life as well, because what we do is just collect evidence constantly of our imposter status, right? So it's much easier to remember the mistakes you made or the questions you couldn't answer, all those things that kind of feed this idea that you're not as competent, rather than all the successes. And you know, when you came out of a meeting, you were like, I really helped that person, or I really knew what I was talking about, then you kind of forget those. So I think a really useful thing, at least for me, has to be to collect those instances, not the instances that are negative, but when I've done things quite well and I've succeeded at something. And that really helps to kind of reduce your imposter syndrome. And then show yourself compassion. So you would really never consider your friends or colleagues to be imposters. And you know, if they struggle to answer a question after a talk, for example, or they got bad review comments, or they missed out on a fellowship, you would never think, oh, it's because they're incompetent or they're stupid. So there's no reason why you should think that of yourself, and certainly they won't be thinking of you in that way either. And then this one, not so simple really, in terms of the imposter syndrome related to race, is really achieving inclusion. Really is the only way, because we need to have representation so that people don't feel tokenized. That's a really big issue that it's really awful feeling, and I really hate when I hear from people that I mentor that they feel like they are a diversity hire, or that they've been tokenized, and that's really that really feeds imposter syndrome as well. And also they feel like other people are viewing them as diversity or tokenism, and until we really have inclusion, you're not going to get rid of that feeling. You know, if you're always the only brown person on a panel, then you're always going to feel like you were put on that panel because you were brown. And then, you know, and there's some research to say that 60% of BAME staff feel that their ability is judged in relation to their ethnicity. So if we had proper inclusion, then those things would be completely divorced, right? Your ability would not be so tied to your ethnicity or your perception of that. And then finally, just to say that no one can be as incompetent or as much as an imposter as the outgoing US president. So just remember that you are not a fraud, but he is. And that's all. Thank you.
Great talk, thank you.
Okay.
If anyone has any questions, you can type them into the chat and I'll read them to Michele. Give people a little time to write something. Okay, so we have one that says, what can other people do to help fight imposter syndrome, for example, in their colleagues?
That's a really good question. I think talking about it really helps. Like the more you talk to people and realize they have the same thing, the better. It's really nice to have colleagues. When I was at the CBU, I had, you know, a room full of PhD students. We all confided in each other a lot, and you know, you'd come back from giving a talk and be like, oh, that was so awful, I can't believe I did this and this, and they would reassure you and say, no, you know, because your perception of yourself is not what other people are perceiving. So it's really important to, you know, talk to other people, give feedback, try to say, you know, positive things to people. You know, when no matter how much people are seasoned speakers, when you've given a talk, it's always really nice when somebody says, you know, that was really great, I really enjoyed it. Those kinds of things, just that positive reinforcement really helps. I think talking about it, just being open and honest about it. I try to be as open as possible about all these things like anxiety, depression. It's so prevalent, and just knowing that other people are going through the same thing really helps.
Anyone else? Yes, this person has, I don't know if you want me to say your name, but there's Carolyn. You're muted, sorry.
Yes, Carolyn Patterson. Sorry, it was wonderful, Michele, and you know, I'm very much aware of how powerful these imposter syndrome feelings are and how difficult they are to overcome. I'd like to add one more point to your 5.
Yes, please.
And what I have tried sometimes, having lived with imposter syndrome so much of my career, what I've tried to advise PhD students and postdocs and other people who come to talk to me about it, which many people are afraid to talk about it, but if they do, what I try to say to them is, you're focusing on the wrong thing. You're instead of thinking about the research that you're doing, which is so fascinating, you're thinking about yourself. It's tough, but try to put the focus on the process instead of the person who's doing it.
Yes, I absolutely love that advice. Honestly, I used to sit in meetings sometimes. Oh, okay. Yeah, I used to sit in meetings sometimes and just solely focus on, oh, what am I going to say? You know, am I going to speak? What do I ask? What question? Am I going to sound stupid? And then just completely miss all the science. And now that I've kind of got to grips with it, I sit and I listen and get involved, and it's a completely different experience. I completely agree with that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I guess one final question, or we can go to the general panel discussion, Camilla?
Yeah, I suppose let's go to the general panel discussion, but if you've got a burning question for Michele that occurs to you in the panel discussion, then go for it. Okay, so we are now opening the floor to kind of everyone who may want to ask a general question to any of the panelists. The majority are rejoining us. I believe that Jo has been unable to, and I think Rogier is on his way. Yeah, but otherwise we're all covered. So ask any kind of questions that you might have in the chat, or if you have a good microphone, you can raise your hand. But otherwise, our preference is chat, so we can ask it. Great. So our first question is from Tristan. And this is for the panel in general, so any of you can leap in. Do you think that changes in policy have helped diversity?
Okay, was that one to me?
Go for it.
I still think there's a problem with diversity and inclusivity, that we're getting sort of there with diversity, but not enough. And the inclusivity is really the key. If we hire people that are diverse, but they don't feel welcome, then they're not going to stay. And also, I think, I don't know, I find it personally, in my department, I find it very strange that we do all this evidence-based research, but we seem to ignore all the evidence out there. And we kind of make these decisions on diversity and inclusivity committees that aren't really evidence-based, or we don't seek outside expertise. And I think that's really frustrating. So for example, we have discussions about, should we have mandatory training? But none of us know the evidence. So we're like, well, some people say, oh, I saw somewhere that maybe it increases prejudices, and then other people are like, oh, well, maybe, and I just think, shouldn't we just go and check the evidence and then make proper decisions? But then, of course, the problem is nobody has the time, and it disproportionately falls on minorities, and then that takes away from their time doing research, and you've got this vicious circle.
I think also there's a mismatch between policy and what actually happens in practice, right? So certainly we've had situations where the policies are brilliant on paper, but in practice they always usually are sort of ended by these comments that say, well, you need to run it by your line manager. And that's great if your line manager's all for these and aware of these issues, and that works really well. But if your line manager isn't, then actually that can lead to real problems. And I think that HR are often quite reluctant to get involved in cases like that, because they don't want to kind of step on the toes of, a senior PI. But actually it should come down to those decisions. And I think that sometimes taking those decisions away from line managers and just putting them just automatically with HR, so that somebody independently can make those decisions about an individual's circumstances in relation to policy, that can just take out some of these ambiguities.
Okay, so a question from Yara to everyone. I think that one important thing in order to achieve more inclusion and diversity is to engage the non-diverse and/or senior people in the scientific community. And I think this meeting actually managed to do this quite well relative to other meetings. What are the ways in which we can achieve this? A really important question that we have struggled with at the CBU.
I mean, I wonder if the organising committee has insight on that, because you're the people who've been kind of like recruiting people to come and watch this. Because I've definitely found that previously, when I've done equality and diversity stuff, it's been sort of all of the equal diverse people talking to each other in a room.
So I kind of initially thought that was a little bit what this event would be, and it actually hasn't turned out that way at all. So from the poll that I did right in the beginning when everyone was joining, we had a really decent percent. I forget what it was like 20% of people here are PIs. Is that right? Yeah, about 20%, about 37% are postdocs, and then the rest are PhD students and students. I think that's a really even distribution. And I'm just actually really impressed. So I don't have any advice. It's just like a really good thing. I suppose we did think about it a little as a committee. This was something that when we, so like Lorna and Shivam and Giugiu and Nadene and Ivan and Victoria and I, we all met and we said, we want to make an E&D day that is not just for like the people who need it, but also the people who want to support the people who need it. So if you're running a lab, this is something I think about a lot. You're a member of some minority groups, but you don't know what to do with other minority groups necessarily. One knowledge doesn't give you translatability to another one. So we wanted to think, let's imagine you're running a lab. What do you want to know to support people who might be from a different group than you are? What can you do? So to kind of stop this unequal dropout. So that was our kind of intention. That's the only thing that we did to help it, I think. I don't know. An interesting question from Lorna. Does anyone think the problems we've talked about are worse somewhere like Cambridge?
So I do not have experience of being at Cambridge or Oxford, but based on the experiences of my disabled friends as students, I would say that it's much harder to be a disabled person at a highly competitive, like highly academically selective university. And I've had several friends who either dropped out or were nearly told to leave the university at Oxford and at Durham because of their health or mental health issues. So I would say that, and in my experience, actually, the more prestigious the university, the less welcoming it has been for me as a disabled person. So even just the difference between Newcastle, which I went to for my undergrad, which is still a Russell Group university, and UCL, which where I went to for my master's, the difference in the support that I had there was really dramatic. So I would say from my perspective, kind of yes, maybe.
Yeah, I asked that question because I do think that I noticed a difference when I moved from UCL to Cambridge, just in terms of the kind of what the PIs looked like. So similar to what Michele was talking about. And I think that at UCL there are a lot of female PIs and it's so normal. And I think I never really thought of myself as being a girl until I moved to Cambridge. And then I remember giving a talk last Christmas and looking out into the audience, and it was kind of a sea of kind of white men, and just thinking, oh my goodness, this is such a different experience from anything that I'd had before. So I think that can really feed into this kind of imposter syndrome if the people that are at the top just really don't resemble you.
Yeah, and I found that so the further along I get in my academic career, the less there is anyone who looks like me, and that makes it more difficult. So, for example, when I was doing my PhD, I was, as far as I can tell, I was the only person who had ever held my particular PhD funding in the department with a disability. So they had no idea, because it wasn't a it was funded by the Research Council, so there was a whole different process to go through for getting disabled students allowance than there was for other PhD students, and no one had ever been through that before. No one had any idea how it worked, and I just had to start from scratch and figure it out. So it's definitely a thing where, like, kind of the more, especially like the more prestigious selective thing, but like the further along in your academic career you get, and the more sort of selective, traditionally, white male able-bodied places you go to, the less you see people who are like you.
Right, well, if anyone else wants to weigh in on that as we go on, I suppose I should have said that I'm really keen to hear from our panel members, obviously, but if any of the rest of you want to weigh in on these, you're more than welcome. It's so great to have all of you here, and many of you I know are extremely knowledgeable about these issues, so I'd love to hear from you. So let's now address Sarah Lloyd Fox's question. So I'll read it out. Can everyone else mute their microphones for a sec? Great, thank you. So Sarah says, I'm a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow, and there was a huge emphasis at our conference last month by UKRI to address equity, diversity, and inclusivity head on and change the landscape that we want to work in. We all found it really inspiring. From this, I took the idea to write and place on the web the research culture pointers that I and my team want to adhere to. Do other panels or panel members already do this? So do you place your research culture pointers online?
I don't, but I'm going to. That's a great idea.
Yeah, me too.
I do, but I guess too minimal. I do have a lab manual online that I let everyone who's joining the lab read and edit and help kind of shape. So it's a work in progress. It will always be a work in progress, but this is something that we have spent some time, yeah, on how to address the kind of inclusivity and best practices, and also how to behave and treat people in the lab when we do talk about it. But it's hard, right? Especially since, yeah, exactly, we are in a massively white, male-dominated university, so you have to really make the extra effort to include people and ask them about their experiences and how we can help.
Can I ask, Sarah, are you able to share some of your research culture pointers? I'd be really interested to know.
Yeah, I can do. Sorry, I'm not actually working today, so I'm doing kitchen things.
No worries.
I mean, I found the conference really inspiring, and there were a lot of workshops that I would love to talk to people at Cambridge about. One of them that I thought was really good as well was about bullying. And we had a whole afternoon session about how to identify bullying better, which came into this idea of being more inclusive. And I thought that was a really good thing to address a bit better, because they were saying people don't usually think about that word as themselves. And in our breakout rooms, we were talking about the fact that actually that does happen a lot, even so much as feeling like you're expected to work in the evenings. That's what I was trying to say in an earlier question, actually, that it wasn't about working hours that are not standard hours. It was about the fact that most academics feel like they have to work a lot of hours to get to a promotion or the next level. And so we were just talking about trying to assess every one of our sort of research kind of level about anything negative they've ever experienced at work, and just finding out the breadth of bullying rather than presuming it falls into categories, and then try and find out that breadth in order to sort of think about positive change. So we can work out how people feel that they're not being included, then maybe we could work out how to address it a bit better. So that was something I thought they were very keen on pursuing with academics, that I thought could be a good way forward. And then that would feed into the research culture. So I have things like, I don't want people to email out of hours. You can work out of hours, but maybe we should start emailing from 9 AM every day for those people that those students that think they have to reply to the PI's email that's coming at 11 PM that wasn't intentionally needing to be replied to, but that was just when the PI worked. So it's these kind of changes of working practices, not just inclusivity for someone because they're female, but just inclusivity for you know, the kind of idea that academia can be for everybody, I suppose. I guess that's what I'm trying to get to, but we're only just starting. I had the conference 2 weeks ago, and my team and I are starting to put that together in terms of what we would hope we'd all try and address, I suppose. So I have a lot of pointers. I won't read them all out, but I'd be happy to talk to anyone about that. In Cambridge.
Thank you. That's really useful. So I'm going to ask Kevin's question now. So Kevin says, we talk about seeing representation or visibility of people that look like you. This is assuming that such things can be seen. What about things that can't be seen, such as sexual orientation?
So when I talk about people who look like you, I'm speaking more metaphorically, I would say, because obviously I don't look like a disabled person. And I think that the the important thing is to be sort of openly whoever you are, is what I'd say. But I know that so some things are more visible and some things aren't invisible. I think the main sort of thing that you can do is find people who are outspoken about who they are.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Sophie. I mean, I don't want to talk too much, but that's certainly something I sympathize with. I've managed to be comfortable enough to be out about being gay in every lab I've ever worked in. But I think that's because everyone I've worked with has fostered an environment where I felt like it would be okay. So I think there's usually been maybe one, maybe two other gay people in my surroundings, and it has really helped. So it's better not to be the only one. Okay, let's ask Julieta's question now. So she says, what are your experiences and ideas around joining forces with workers' unions?
I don't want to be the only person talking in response to all of this, but I'm a member of UCU, and the four-fight dispute that was going on in March this year overlaps a lot with a lot of the issues that people face because they're a minority. So that was around equal pay, fighting precarity in academia, and there were 4 Ps or maybe 3 Ps, and I can never remember what all the Ps are. But so I definitely think that workers' unions are a good way to promote equality.
All right, a follow-up to Yara's question has now come from Rick, which is quite interesting. So he asks, should we actively encourage non-minority senior academics to mentor minority ECRs rather than seeking mentors who are also from a minority, i.e. role models, so senior people learn about the barriers even if they haven't experienced them themselves? Two-way benefit. So this idea of a mutual mentoring scheme is actually a very good one at the moment. I've seen it in some places. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think I think it's a great idea, but I do think we need multiple mentors, because I personally need the perspective of somebody who's gone through what I'm likely to go through. And like, for instance, sometimes I have a mentor who I ask, who's very senior, who I can ask if I've been asked to do things as a token, basically. So when I'm asked to do things, I ask him, is this tokenism? And he says, no. I know, I was in the meeting, this was genuinely because of your ability. That's the kind of thing I have to do. But yeah, I think you need probably both.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think so. I've never had a mentor who is disabled. And I've had mentors who share other protected characteristics with me. Like I've had women who've mentored me, but I have to explain my disability and the challenges that I face because of my disability to everyone that I work with every time. I think that it would be, I would really value having like a role model in a senior position who shares the struggles that I've shared, so that I don't have to explain myself. And I do think that I think it's a really good idea to have that two-way exchange, but at the same time, it's not necessarily the minority person's responsibility to educate other people. So we need to bear that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the most useful mentors that I've had have been people who in positions that I would aspire to be in, and they've helped me at times where, you know, at those crunch points that I've talked about, going on, you know, getting pregnant, being on maternity leave, coming back after maternity leave. And I think if I'd have gone to, I don't know, a senior male PI and talked about this stuff, I'm not sure how helpful that would have been for me. Maybe for them, they might have had a real insight into all sorts of things, but I'm not sure that it would have helped me. And I think that a lot of the role of a mentor, it's not for them to tell you what to do, it's for you to kind of talk and for you to come up with your own ideas. But I think that has to be a really supportive environment where you are able to do that. And if you're feeling maybe not fully understood, then you might not get the same benefit from that relationship. So personally, I think it's a really good idea for PIs or for non-minority senior academics to educate themselves about the issues, but I'm not sure that it should fall on individuals to do that. But that's just my own view.
I think what they can do is act as sponsors. So when you have many opportunities, then you can use that to help minority scientists, you know, advance their careers.
Okay, if there are no more thoughts on that, then I'm going to ask Becky Jackson's question, which is about interview panels. So this literally just happened on an interview panel I was sitting on yesterday. A common interview question is, where do you see yourself in 5 to 10 years? Typically, there's a correct answer to this, i.e. full-time research, next fellowship position, etc. Should we be moving away from asking this to allow for other career options, e.g. working part-time with a family or alongside other goals, or should we continue to ask the question but be more accepting of diverse answers?
May I make a comment on that, even though I'm not a panel? It was very related to something that happened to me, just in terms of that whole, I'm going to quit academia because I feel like I'm an imposter. Yes, definitely. And I don't like the view of other academics, definitely. They look too stressed. So I nearly left academia about 2.5 years ago. And then I had the UKRI Future Leaders interview come up and thought, well, I'll try that. I'll see if I want to do that. I'm not sure I do. So I went into it with quite I'm just going to be brutally honest to every question. And I reflected on why I am a leader, because I knew that question would come up because it's a leader fellowship. And so I replied with that answer. I said, I want to be a leader by inspiring women and men and others to feel that they can work part-time, support their family, have a caregiving role, work outside of work in voluntary capacities, and have a successful career. And that's what I replied, and I got the fellowship. So I do think that definitely that was the massive impression I got from UKRI, is that they're really trying to change the way that people get grant applications, particularly people of our career level, where we're worrying how to kind of get that promotion. So I guess I do think that's a really annoying question. I hate it. And maybe it does need to be answered in other ways, because maybe the person that employs you is the kind of person you want to be able to answer that question in that way too, instead of pretending with that silly usual response.
I gave a talk a while ago to the OHBM students and postdocs, and I'm amazed at how often people are worried about whether they should declare whether they're pregnant to their PIs, or when they should, or you know, it's crazy that that we have to worry about this stuff that you don't want to take because of the nature of these short-term contracts as well. Yeah, people are very worried about this, and they, you know, people are almost trying to plan their lives around, you know, their academic progression, even though there's absolutely no guarantees. You know, it's like, exactly when should I be having a child? And it's, yeah, none of your employer's business what you do with your self.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that, you know, I've answered similar questions to that. And I think that I have certainly moved to be more honest about balancing work and life. I'm part-time and I've still got the fellowship that I got, being brutally honest about the balance that I'm able to give to work. So I think that funders at least are definitely becoming more aware of these things. I think that maybe institutions are less good at that. So certainly when you see jobs advertised for permanent positions, it's very, very rare that you see that they would consider part-time applicants. And I think that is an issue for many reasons. So yeah, I think that funders are getting there and maybe institutions are sort of lagging a little bit.
Okay, I'm going to read out Carolyn Patterson's question now. And I believe this refers to Tristan, in fact. Some years ago, the person in charge of inviting Zangwo Club speakers decided to have one term where every speaker was a woman. I approved. I also think that minority group academics are seriously underrepresented in our speaker series. That is surely something that we could address. This is actually something that I have spoken with Kate. Are you Kate Baker, are you still here? I can't see you. You were here earlier. So this is something I've talked about with our Chaucer Club organizers, who put an enormous amount of effort into having a kind of decent representation of women in our speaker lineups here, but it's much more difficult to have any other kind of representation among speakers. And at the moment, that is not something that they have been capable of doing. So anyone who has managed to kind of diversify their speaker list in a good way, please advise.
I usually don't like to speak, in these things, but I'll explain the underlying idea and the experience. The experience is much more interesting. The underlying idea, you can all imagine you're here in this particular day. So yeah, increase diversity and highlight people who would not normally be there. And the Sangwell Club has been there for a number of years. I went to do the statistics, and it was just appalling, the amount of just old white males, particularly British, in the history of the Sangwell. Despite the fact that that was not even the proportion that you see at the senior level in the department, where there are quite a few women and not necessarily white. I decided to do one term. I ended up doing 2 terms because with a bit of push, I got enough propose women, or non-male in fact, to fill 2, so 20 talks. It was difficult, more difficult than previous years. Women did not answer to my invitations, or took longer, and I had to push them, a lot of them, and they said, oh, actually, sorry, I didn't come back to you, imposter syndrome type. Some of them actually told me directly that I didn't think they deserved to be in the Sangwell Club, which I said, that's not your, that's not for you to say. I'm inviting you. Someone said your name, so believe, because it's not up to you. I don't believe, I don't deserve to be here. Like, you can decide not to say that you're busy, but we are inviting you. But the big struggle was to ask for names to the department people, and they gave me always males. When I said, can you give me at least one male and 1 female? And then still I got a lot of just males. So I end up asking in a very brutal manner, only give me female names for the next Sangwell term. And then I started to get the possible names to invite. So it wasn't just easy. It needed a lot of sort of engineering, and even sometimes calling some PIs and, hey, can I have a suggestion? You always suggest people and you haven't so far yet. So yeah, that's the experience for me is much more interesting if you're going this route, to actually be very active and very frontal about what you want. This is exactly the same way I did this term, and this term it's fairly non-white and fairly much into the the politics and current climate. So we have a lot of things about racial equality and the psychology of climate change, and etc. etc. You can check this term So if this is going to continue, happy to hear your thoughts about it.
I think now there's sort of Black in neuro and queer in neuro, and there's lots of women's lists that I think are trying to make this easier for people. So hopefully that helps.
Great.
Yeah, I was at the Black in Neuro. It was really, really great. Like all the talks and stuff was really good.
So we're going to wrap up perfectly on time, but if anyone has any burning final questions, they're welcome to ask them. Otherwise, or in the meantime, I'm going to send like 4 tiny short feedback questions so that we can make this better next year, thanks to your help. So I'm so grateful to all of you who came and experimented with a Zoom E&D day. I hope it was okay. Yeah, thank you all so much for coming.